The morning sun cast long shadows across the broken mesa when Jake Morrison first saw the smoke rising from Devil's Canyon. It wasn't the kind of smoke that came from campfires or cabins. This was black, thick, and carried the stench of burning sage and something else he couldn't name, something that made his stomach turn and his hand drift instinctively to the Colt at his hip. Jake had been riding hard for 3 days, following the trail of the men who'd burned his brother's homestead and left young Tommy's body twisted in the ashes. The sheriff in Tombstone had called it Apache work, but Jake knew better. He'd seen Apache raids before, and they didn't leave silver dollars scattered in the dirt or smoke Cuban cigars while they worked. No, this was white man's cruelty dressed up as Indian savagery, and Jake aimed to find the truth, even if it killed him. His sorrel mare, Duchess, snorted and tossed her head as they approached the canyon rim. The smoke was stronger here, acrid and wrong. Jake dismounted and crept to the edge, his boots silent on the sandstone. What he saw below made his blood freeze in his veins. 3 men in cavalry uniforms stood around a fire pit, but they weren't soldiers. Jake could tell by the way they wore their blues, sloppy and wrong. In the center of their circle, tied to a wooden post, was a figure that took Jake's breath away. It was a woman, but not like any woman he'd ever seen. Her skin was bronzed by sun and wind, her long black hair streaked with silver despite her apparent youth. She wore buckskin decorated with beads and feathers, and around her neck hung a collection of bones, stones, and what looked like animal teeth. "She won't talk, Sergeant," one of the fake soldiers was saying, his voice carrying up the canyon walls. "Been at it for 2 hours, and she just keeps humming that heathen song." The man he'd called Sergeant, a thick-set brute with a scar across his cheek, walked closer to the bound woman. "Medicine woman," he spat. "Shaman, these witches are tougher than regular squaws." He backhanded her across the face, and Jake's finger tightened on his rifle trigger. "Tell us where they buried the gold, witch," the sergeant growled. "We know your people took it from the wagon train. Tell us, and we'll make it quick." The woman raised her head, and even from his perch high above, Jake could see the defiance in her dark eyes. When she spoke, her voice was like wind through dry grass, melodic and strange. "Gold is Earth's blood," she said in accented English. "You spill it, you die." The third man, younger than the others, laughed nervously. "Spooky talk, boys. Maybe we should just—" "Shut up, Collins," the sergeant snapped. He turned back to the woman. "Last chance, witch. Where's the gold?" She began to hum again, a low, haunting melody that seemed to make the very air vibrate. The sergeant's face twisted with rage, and he drew his sidearm. "Have it your way." Jake didn't think. He couldn't. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, and the sergeant spun around, clutching his gun hand. Blood seeped between his fingers as his weapon flew into the fire pit. "Up on the rim!" Collins shouted, diving for cover behind a boulder. The third man was already scrambling for his rifle. Jake levered another round and fired again, this time sending Collins' hat spinning into the dust. "Next one goes through your head," he called down. "Drop your weapons and ride out." For a moment the canyon held its breath. Then the sergeant, cradling his wounded hand, nodded to his men. "This ain't over, mister," he shouted up at Jake. "We'll be back with more men." "I'll be waiting," Jake replied, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. He watched as the 3 men gathered their horses and rode out, leaving their prisoner behind. When the dust settled, Jake made his way down the treacherous canyon path. The woman watched him approach with those same dark eyes, neither grateful nor afraid. Up close, he could see the intricate patterns painted on her face in red and yellow ochre, and the way her buckskin dress was cut and beaded in designs he'd never seen before. "You're hurt," he said, noticing the blood on her lip where the sergeant had struck her. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Why do you help me, white man?" Jake cut through the ropes binding her to the post, careful not to touch her skin. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. She rubbed her wrists where the ropes had chafed, never taking her eyes off him. "They will return. With more men, more guns. Then we better not be here when they do." Jake gestured toward his horse. "Can you ride?" Instead of answering, she whistled, a sound like a hawk's cry that echoed off the canyon walls. Within moments, a paint horse appeared from behind a cluster of rocks, as if it had been waiting. The animal was magnificent, its coat a mixture of brown and white patches that seemed to shift and flow like water. "I am Aiyana," she said, swinging onto her horse's back with fluid grace. "Moon Woman." "And you are?" "Jake Morrison." He mounted Duchess, still watching the canyon rim for signs of pursuit. "And right now, I'm a man who's made some powerful enemies." She almost smiled at that. "Good. I do not trust men who have no enemies." They rode out of Devil's Canyon as the sun reached its zenith, heading north toward the high country where the air was thin and the law was whatever a man made of it. Jake had intended to continue hunting his brother's killers, but something about the woman, Aiyana, made him reconsider. Maybe it was the way she sat her horse, straight and proud despite what she'd endured. Maybe it was the haunting melody she'd hummed in the face of death, or maybe it was the way she looked at him, as if she could see straight through to his soul. "Those men," he said as they picked their way through a field of broken shale. "They were asking about gold." Aiyana nodded. "3 days ago, wagon train came through my people's sacred valley, white men with boxes of yellow metal. They stopped at the spring, made camp." She paused, her face growing dark. "That night, shadows came, killed the wagon people, took the gold. But they wore paint like my people, moved like my people. But they weren't your people." "No." Her voice was flat, certain. "My people do not kill for gold. We know what it brings. Madness, death, the end of all good things." She looked at him sideways. "But someone wants others to believe we did." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. A setup, make it look like Apache work, then come back as heroes to recover the stolen gold. "And kill any who might speak the truth," Aiyana added. They rode in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The trail wound higher into the mountains, through stands of pine and aspen that whispered secrets in the wind. Jake found himself stealing glances at his companion, fascinated by the way she moved with her horse, as if they were one creature instead of two. "You're not like other white men," she said suddenly. Jake almost smiled. "So I've been told. Usually not as a compliment. My father once said that a man's spirit shows in how he treats those who cannot help him." She studied his profile. "You had nothing to gain by saving me, everything to lose. Maybe I'm just tired of seeing good people suffer for other men's greed." This time she did smile, and it transformed her face completely. "Moon Woman sees much, Jake Morrison, and she sees that you carry great pain." He didn't answer, but something in his chest tightened. They were climbing now, following a game trail that barely deserved the name. The horses' hooves rang against stone, and their breath began to mist in the cooling air. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Aiyana raised her hand, signaling a halt. "We rest here tonight," she said, indicating a sheltered spot beneath an overhanging rock. "Tomorrow we reach the sacred valley." Jake dismounted and began to unsaddle Duchess. "Is that where you're from? The sacred valley?" Aiyana swung down from her paint horse and began gathering deadwood for a fire. "I am from many places and none. My people are scattered like seeds on the wind. But the valley, that is where the earth speaks loudest." She built the fire with practiced ease, using flint and steel to coax flame from tinder. As darkness fell around them, the firelight danced across her face, highlighting the painted designs and making her eyes gleam like obsidian. "Tell me about your brother," she said quietly. Jake's hands stilled on the coffee pot he was preparing. "How did you—" "The way you speak of good people suffering, the anger in your voice when you talk about greed." She fed another stick to the fire. "And the way you look at me sometimes, like you're seeing someone else." Jake was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he began to speak. "Tommy was younger than me by 10 years. Our parents died of fever when he was just a boy, so I raised him." He poured water into the coffee pot and set it near the coals. He was everything I wasn't. Gentle, trusting, saw the good in everyone. And someone killed him. Burned him alive in his own cabin. Jake's voice was flat, emotionless. Sheriff said it was Apache raiders, but I found things that didn't fit. Cuban cigar ash. Silver dollars in the dirt. And Tommy's land, it sits right on top of the richest vein of silver in the territory. Aiyana nodded slowly. So you hunt the men who killed him? I was. Until I saw you tied to that post. Jake looked at her across the fire. Strange how paths cross in the wilderness. Not strange, she said softly. Meant to be. The Earth Mother brings together those who need each other. Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the fire. I'm not a good man, Aiyana. I've killed. I've done things, as have I. Her voice was calm, matter-of-fact. To protect my people, to survive. But the Earth Mother does not judge us by our worst moments. She judges us by what we choose to do when we still have choice. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the mountains. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, and Aiyana's paint horse nickered softly in response. What did they mean when they called you a shaman? Jake asked. Aiyana's fingers went to the collection of bones and stones around her neck. I am a bridge between worlds. I speak with spirits, heal the sick, guide the lost. She looked at him directly. And sometimes I help lost souls find their way home. Jake felt something shift inside him, like a door opening in a room he'd kept locked for years. And if a soul is too lost, too stained with blood and regret, then perhaps it needs to find someone worth becoming clean for. The words hung between them like a promise. Jake reached across the fire and gently touched her hand. Her skin was warm, soft, despite the calluses from years of hard living. She didn't pull away. Those men will come back, he said quietly. Yes, and they will bring others. Then we need to be ready for them. Aiyana smiled, and in that smile Jake saw something that made his heart race. We, Jake Morrison, you would stand with me against your own people. My people don't murder innocent women and blame it on others. Jake's voice was steady, certain. My people don't burn families alive for their land. If that's what makes a man white, then I don't want to be white. She studied his face in the firelight, as if memorizing every line and scar. You would die for this? For me? I'd live for it, Jake replied. That's harder. They made love under the stars, slowly, reverently, as if they were sealing a pact with the universe itself. Aiyana's painted face was beautiful in the moonlight. Her hair spread across Jake's bedroll like spilled ink. She guided him with gentle hands and whispered words in her native tongue, and when they moved together, it was like a dance, older than time itself. Afterward they lay entwined, sharing warmth and breath and secrets. Aiyana traced the scars on Jake's chest, bullet wounds, knife cuts, the marks of a violent life, and somehow made them feel like badges of honor instead of shame. Tomorrow, she said softly, we reach the sacred valley, and there we will find the truth. Jake held her closer, already dreading the sunrise. And after that, we build something new, something that cannot be burned or stolen or destroyed by small-minded men. Jake woke to the sound of horses and voices echoing off the canyon walls. He sat up carefully, not wanting to wake Aiyana, and peered over the edge of their rocky shelter. Below, in the pre-dawn darkness, he could see the glow of torches and the silhouettes of mounted men. At least a dozen, he whispered to Aiyana, who was already awake and reaching for her bow. The sergeant brought friends, she said calmly, as if discussing the weather. Jake counted the riders again. 15 men, all armed, all looking like they meant business. We can't fight them all. We don't have to. Aiyana was already moving, gathering her gear with practiced efficiency. The sacred valley is close. There, we will have advantages. They saddled their horses in silence, communicating with gestures and glances. The paint of their pursuers was growing louder, more confident. Jake could hear the sergeant's voice barking orders, organizing the men into search parties. They're not soldiers, Aiyana observed, listening to the shouted commands. Miners, maybe, Drifters, men who kill for money. Makes sense, Jake said, checking his rifle. Easier to buy a dozen killers than convince a dozen honest men to murder an innocent woman. They led their horses quietly away from the camp, moving deeper into the mountains. The trail here was treacherous, barely wide enough for a single horse, with sheer drops on both sides. But it was their only way to the sacred valley, and their only hope of survival. The sun was rising as they reached the valley's entrance, a narrow gap between two towering stone pillars that seemed to guard the passage like ancient sentinels. Aiyana paused at the threshold, closed her eyes, and whispered something in her native tongue. Then she looked at Jake with an expression he'd never seen before. "Whatever happens beyond this point," she said, "know that you have been accepted by the Earth Mother. This valley will either save us or claim us, but it will not let us be dishonored." Jake nodded, not fully understanding but trusting her completely. They passed between the stone pillars and into the sacred valley beyond. The valley was like nothing Jake had ever seen. It was perfectly circular, perhaps a mile across, with walls of red sandstone rising on all sides. A clear stream ran through the center, fed by a waterfall that cascaded down the far wall. The grass was green and lush, dotted with wildflowers that seemed to glow in the morning light. But it was the silence that struck Jake most. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something deeper, a peace that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. His horse felt it too, stepping more carefully, as if she understood she was in a holy place. "This is where they camped," Aiyana said, pointing to a cleared area near the stream. "The wagon train. And there," she indicated a grove of cottonwoods. "That is where the shadows came from." Jake dismounted and examined the ground. The signs were faint after 3 days, but he could still make out wagon ruts, the remains of campfires, and darker stains in the earth that spoke of violence. But there was something else, footprints that didn't match the boots of the murdered travelers. "Look at this," he called Aiyana over. "These prints. They're moccasins, but the stride is wrong, too long, too heavy." Aiyana knelt beside him, her fingers tracing the outline of the prints. "White men," she said with certainty, "wearing moccasins to leave false signs. But why kill the travelers? Why not just steal the gold?" "Because dead men tell no tales," she stood, brushing dust from her knees. "And because someone needed a reason to hunt my people. A massacre brings soldiers, brings bounty hunters, brings men like those who follow us now." Jake felt the pieces clicking together in his mind. "It's bigger than just stolen gold. Someone's trying to clear the Apache out of this whole territory and pin the blame on us for crimes we did not commit." Aiyana's voice was bitter. "It is an old story, Jake Morrison, as old as the first white man who looked at our land and decided it should be his." They were interrupted by the sound of voices echoing off the valley walls. Their pursuers had found the entrance. Jake grabbed his rifle and looked for cover, but Aiyana caught his arm. "No," she said firmly. "Not here. This is a sacred place. We do not spill blood here unless we have no choice." "Then what do we do?" She smiled, and there was something wild and dangerous in her expression. "We let the valley speak for itself." Aiyana led him to a cave hidden behind the waterfall. It was larger than it appeared from outside, with walls covered in ancient paintings, stick figures of men and animals, spirals and symbols that seemed to dance in the flickering light from their torch. "Wait here," she said, beginning to remove items from her medicine bundle. "And no matter what you hear, do not come out until I call for you." "Aiyana, I'm not going to hide while you—" "This is not about hiding." Her voice was commanding, authoritative in a way he'd never heard before. "This is about trust. Do you trust me, Jake Morrison?" He looked into her eyes and saw something ancient and powerful staring back at him. "Yes." "Then wait." She left him in the cave and walked back out into the valley. Jake watched through the curtain of water as she took position in the center of the clearing, directly beside the stream. She had changed somehow, Her posture was different, more formal, and she held herself like a queen receiving subjects. The sergeant and his men rode into the valley in a loose formation, their horses nervous and skittish. Jake could see the uncertainty in their faces as they took in the strange beauty of the place, the oppressive silence that seemed to press down on them like a physical weight. "There she is, boys," the sergeant called out, his voice echoing strangely off the valley walls. "The witch who murdered innocent folks for their gold." Aiyana didn't move, didn't speak. She simply stood there, waiting. "Where's your boyfriend, witch?" the sergeant continued, his wounded hand wrapped in a dirty bandage. "The one who shot me yesterday?" Still no response. Some of the men were looking around nervously, as if expecting an ambush. Their horses were becoming increasingly agitated, snorting and prancing, despite their riders' attempts to control them. "Cat got your tongue?" The sergeant drew his gun with his good hand. "That's all right. Dead women don't talk anyway." That's when Aiyana began to sing. It started as a low humming, the same melody Jake had heard in Devil's Canyon. But as her voice grew stronger, the sound seemed to fill the entire valley, resonating off the stone walls and creating harmonies that shouldn't have been possible from a single voice. The effect on the horses was immediate and dramatic. They began to rear and buck, their eyes rolling white with terror. Several of the men were thrown from their saddles, landing hard on the rocky ground. Those who managed to stay mounted found themselves fighting just to keep their animals from fleeing. "Shut up," the sergeant shouted, trying to aim his gun at Aiyana. But his horse was spinning in circles, and he couldn't get a clear shot. "Shut up, you witch!" Aiyana's song grew louder, more complex. Jake could hear voices joining hers, impossible voices, as if the valley itself was singing along. The air began to shimmer with heat, even though the sun was still hidden behind the eastern wall. Then the earth began to tremble. It started as a barely perceptible vibration, like the rumble of distant thunder, but it grew stronger, more insistent, until loose stones began to fall from the canyon walls. The stream changed course, flowing backwards for a moment before resuming its normal path. "What the hell?" one of the men began, but his words were cut off as his horse bolted toward the valley entrance. Within seconds, half the riders were in full retreat, their mounts carrying them away, despite their efforts to control them. The sergeant was made of sterner stuff. He finally managed to dismount and take aim at Aiyana on foot. "I don't care what kind of heathen magic you're using," he snarled. "You're still just a woman, and women bleed like anyone else." But as he pulled the trigger, something extraordinary happened. The bullet seemed to slow in mid-air, wobbling like a bee trying to find its way home. It struck a stone beside Aiyana's feet and ricocheted harmlessly into the stream. The sergeant's face went white. "What in the name of—" He never finished the sentence. The ground beneath his feet suddenly gave way, and he disappeared into a sinkhole that hadn't been there moments before. His screams echoed from the depths for a few seconds, then stopped abruptly. The remaining men didn't need any more encouragement. They abandoned their horses and ran for the valley entrance on foot, stumbling and falling in their haste to escape. Within minutes, Aiyana and Jake were alone in the sacred valley. Jake emerged from the cave, his mind reeling from what he'd witnessed. "How did you— What was that?" Aiyana swayed on her feet, suddenly looking exhausted. "The Earth Mother protects her own," she said simply, "but such power comes with a price." Jake caught her as she started to fall, holding her steady against his chest. "Are you all right?" "I will be. But we must leave this place now. The valley has been awakened, and it will not rest until the sun sets." She looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than the mountains themselves. "And there is something else. Something I must show you." She led him to the grove of cottonwoods where the massacre had taken place. But instead of examining the ground, she began to dig with her hands, clawing at the earth with desperate urgency. Jake joined her, using his knife to cut through roots and stones. They found the gold 15 minutes later, not buried deep, but hidden in a shallow cache beneath a fallen log. It was exactly as the sergeant had described. Boxes of coins and ingots, enough to buy a small army or fund a war. This is what they killed for, Aiyana said, staring at the gleaming metal. This is what they were willing to destroy my people for. Jake lifted one of the coins, feeling its weight in his palm. It's more than just gold, isn't it? Someone's planning something big, something that requires a lot of money and a lot of dead Apache. A war, Aiyana confirmed. Drive out the Apache, claim their land, and sell it to the highest bidder. The gold funds the private army. The massacre justifies the slaughter. Jake made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He began gathering the gold, stuffing it into his saddlebags and Aiyana's medicine bundle. Then we take away their funding, and we make sure the truth gets told. Where will we go? Aiyana asked, helping him load the precious metal. South, past the border, where the reach of corrupt officials and bought judges can't touch us. Jake secured the last of the gold and looked at her seriously. But first, we're going to make sure justice is served. They rode out of the sacred valley as the sun reached its zenith, the silence following them like a benediction. Behind them, the waterfall sang its ancient song, and the earth slowly settled back into its eternal rest. The town of Copper Creek had never seen anything like the two riders who appeared on Main Street that dusty Thursday afternoon. The man was tall and weathered, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much and decided to keep seeing anyway. The woman beside him was clearly Apache, but she rode with the dignity of a queen and wore traditional dress that gleamed with silver and turquoise. They rode directly to the sheriff's office, dismounted, and walked inside as if they owned the place. Sheriff Dalton looked up from his desk, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun. "Can I help you folks?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Jake set a leather pouch on the desk. It clinked with the sound of metal on metal. "Information about the wagon train massacre in the Sacred Valley. And about the men who really did it." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "I heard that was Apache work, whole different matter from civilian law." "That's what someone wanted you to think," Aiyana said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was clear, educated, nothing like the broken English most whites expected from an Apache woman. But the truth has a way of surfacing, like oil on water. Jake opened the pouch and poured out a handful of silver dollars. The sheriff's expression changed immediately. These were the same coins that had been reported missing from the wagon train. "Where did you get these?" "From the same place we got this." Jake produced a piece of paper, a letter written in the sergeant's own hand, detailing the plan to frame the Apache for the massacre. They'd found it in his saddlebags, after the earth had claimed him. The sheriff read the letter twice, his face growing paler with each word. This changes everything. If this is true, it's true," Aiyana said firmly. "And there are witnesses who can verify it. Apache, who saw the false war party, who recognized the men beneath the paint." "But they're Apache," the sheriff protested. "No court would take their word over a dead man's confession," Jake interrupted. "Over physical evidence, over the testimony of a white man who was there." The sheriff looked at Jake with new respect. "You're willing to testify? To go against your own people?" "My people don't murder innocent families for their land," Jake replied. "My people don't dress up like Indians to commit massacres. If that's what you think makes a man white, then I don't want to be white." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, weighing his options. Finally, he stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dusty street. "There are going to be a lot of powerful people who don't want this story told. Mine owners, land speculators, maybe even some folks in the territorial government. Then it's a good thing we made copies," Aiyana said with a slight smile. "The story is already on its way to newspapers in Phoenix, Denver, and San Francisco. The truth will come out, Sheriff Dalton. The question is whether you'll be remembered as the man who helped it along or the man who tried to stop it." The sheriff turned back to them, and Jake could see the moment when he made his decision. "All right, I'll need full statements from both of you, and I'll need to know where I can find those Apache witnesses." "They'll come forward when they know it's safe," Aiyana promised. "But first, we need your word that you'll protect them, and us." "You have it," the sheriff said, extending his hand. "Welcome to the right side of the law, Mr. Morrison, Jake Morrison, and this is my wife, Aiyana." The sheriff's eyebrows rose slightly, but he shook Jake's hand firmly. "Well, Mrs. Morrison, looks like you two just saved this territory from a war it didn't know it was about to fight."
6 months later, Jake and Aiyana stood on the porch of their small ranch house, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The trial had been a sensation, with newspaper reporters coming from as far away as New York to cover the story of the Apache shaman who had exposed a conspiracy to steal her people's land.
The corrupt officials had been arrested, the mine owners had been forced to pay reparations, and the Apache had been granted permanent title to their sacred valley. It wasn't perfect justice, nothing ever was, but it was a start. Aiyana leaned against Jake's shoulder, one hand resting on her swollen belly. Their child would be born with the autumn rains, a living symbol of the peace they'd helped to create. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Giving up your old life to stand with me?" Jake wrapped his arms around her, feeling the baby kick against his palm. "My old life was just surviving. This is living." And in the distance, a hawk circled lazily on the evening thermals, its cry echoing off the valley walls. Below them, their small herd of cattle grazed peacefully in the fading light, and somewhere in the darkness, the sacred valley sang its ancient song of renewal and hope. "What will we name the baby?" Jake asked, his lips against her hair. Aiyana smiled, her hand covering his. "If it's a boy, we'll call him Thomas, after your brother. And if it's a girl, Aiyana," she said softly. "Moon Woman, because some names carry too much power to be lost." Jake held her tighter, thinking of all the paths that had led them to this moment. The violence, the hatred, the seemingly impossible divide between their worlds. But love, he'd learned, was stronger than fear. Truth was stronger than lies, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, you could find someone worth changing the world for. The stars came out one by one, brilliant in the clear mountain air. And in the small ranch house beneath them, two people who had found each other against all odds, prepared to welcome a new life into a world they'd helped to make just a little bit better. The story of Jake Morrison and Aiyana would be told for generations, not just as a tale of love conquering prejudice, but as proof that ordinary people could stand up to extraordinary evil and win. The sacred valley would remember them, and the earth would sing their song long after their names were forgotten. But that night, as they lay in each other's arms and listened to the coyotes calling in the distance, they were just a man and a woman who had found something worth fighting for, and in the end, that was more than enough. The valley had changed them, and they had changed the valley. And somewhere in the darkness, the future stirred like a child in the womb, full of promise and hope, and the endless possibility of what love could create when it refused to surrender to hate.